Minister in the presidency, Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, is in Russia to meet with top-ranking officials to discuss global security matters. Ntshavheni is expected to engage with relevant authorities on African leaders' peace mission. 6 African leaders are scheduled to travel to Ukraine and Russia to discuss a possible end to the war. President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the initiative last week. He added that Presidents Vladimir Putin and Volodymir Zelenskys both welcomed the initiative and agreed to receive the mission separately. The move comes as South Africa faces immense pressure to pick a side in the war, following accusations from the United States that Pretoria supplied weapons to Moscow. One of Africa's arts and culture events has kicked off at the Arusha International Conference Center in Tanzania. The second festival of black arts and culture, known as Festac, is expected to bring together artists from all over the continent and its diaspora to the week-long event. Speaking during the official opening ceremony, former director of the Kenyan Anti-Corruption Agency, Professor PLO Lumumba, has emphasized the importance of the festival.
That culture is the very foundation of our being, giving meaning to the Kiswahili saying, Mwachamila ni mtumwa. So Festac is designed to remind us that we are, and that Africa is the cradle of humanity, and that all human beings, wherever they are, came out of this mother continent.
Okay, let's speak about the conclusion of the G7 summit. You'll remember that South Africa was not invited this time, but rather a representative from the African Union. We speak to international relations expert, Professor John Stremlau. Thank you very much, Prof, for your time this afternoon. Is it safe to say, well, now we know why South Africa was not invited to the G7?
Well, you could say that because obviously there is a desire on the part of the G7 to shore up Ukraine as much as possible in the near term, and that South Africa and the other 5 African leaders in this peace initiative is not going to go very far. And it also reflects the feeling that South Africa is, in fact, more supportive of Russia than it is non-aligned, whatever the non-aligned means today.
Look at what came out of the G7 meeting with Volodymyr Zelenskys, essentially more support for the country. And so what should we understand from that? On the one hand, there's talk of ending the hostilities. On the other hand, there's giving the other party an upper hand, for lack of a better expression.
Well, I've been saying that the conflict is not really ripe for resolution, and it may well be ripe in 6 months' time, and the Chinese can play a very important role in that if they choose to do so. But I just can't resist noting the irony of the former colonial powers meeting in Hiroshima and the military opposition of the World War II meeting in Hiroshima and supporting the liberation and the sovereign equality and the territorial integrity of Ukraine against the colonial power, whereas the global South, whatever that is amounting to today, is those who are taking a non-aligned position are in fact supporting the colonial authorities. That's another irony, which is Putin's Russia, which is clearly wants to dominate its neighbor.
What do you mean Putin's Russia is the colonial? I beg your pardon.
Well, colonialism is the control of another state, a sovereign and independent state. And the takeover of Ukraine, which has a long history, don't forget 30 million, the Stalin was of a very brutal regime, but 5 or 6 million Ukrainians perished as he seized food back in the 1930s, and they have a long memory of Russian domination, and they don't want it now. They want to be aligned with the West and with the European Union. And so what I'm seeing from the assistance is that most of the biggest donors as a proportion of GNP are Latvia and Estonia, Lithuania, the Baltic states that were part of the former Soviet Union's empire. And that empire dissolved in the early 1990s, and Russia seems bent on trying to recolonize at least the Ukraine and other former republics of the Soviet Union. But they're doing so in a pan-Russian way, not in a communist or a Soviet mindset.
Global South, and you say whatever that is amounting to. What does that mean?
Well, I studied the non-aligned movement in Bandung, which was Indonesia, in the 50s, and they tried to separate the independent states from colonial powers and to encourage the decolonization. Well, the decolonization has all occurred now. It occurred in the early 60s, and that's bred this irony where the former colonial powers are the advocates of sovereign equality and territorial integrity in the case of Ukraine. And I would think that the Global South would celebrate that as a step forward and call for the reform of the Security Council, which is also dominated by Russia, that was in the chair when the invasion of Ukraine was launched back in February of 2022. So the ironies abound here, but relations do change, and people change, and countries change. So therefore, you ought to be a little more nimble than the current ironies that I referred to of the Global South and the former colonial powers. And there's another irony, which is the unreliability of the United States. If you got Donald Trump back in the White House, you'd have an ally of Vladimir Putin. After all, it was Trump that called in 2017 for Putin to rejoin the Group of Seven and make it again the Group of Eight. And he questioned the viability of the Group of Seven and was seen as hostile to the Group of Seven. So, again, the ironies abound because Trump could be viable in the U.S. domestic polarized circumstances.
Prof, please do indulge me. This is going to be super simple because I just need to understand. So when you speak of the colonization, you say by Russia to Ukraine, and then you speak of the Global South and the irony of those in the Global South now supporting a former colonizer, you say. I hope I'm not getting the gist of
supporting a reborn colonizer, which is namely the Russian ethnic nationalism that motivates Vladimir Putin, who sees himself, I think, as the nationalism and the determination of the Ukrainian people despite all the suffering. And the final irony is that the public in South Africa seems to be in support of it, but I have endless debates about this issue within our ANC Jeanette Schoon branch in the 87 Ward, where we're very, very divided about it.
Is that not what a healthy democracy is? But I think I just want to go back to the colonization point just to understand. So when the demand is made of the countries in the Global South, some of them maybe in particular more pointedly on the continent, is it fair to draw parallels or to even link the two when we speak of colonization and the effects that are still felt on this continent? And then when we speak of the United Nations Security Council, for how long must the continent petition to be part of the United Nations Security Council? It's been how many years?
Well, I've always said, and not in my lifetime when I see a reform of the UN Security Council, even though I desire that very much because it is not representative. It's a post-World War II settlement agreement that the major powers insisted on. And now the irony is that the U.S. is embracing, and the G7 are embracing the values of the founding fathers of the UN, territorial integrity and sovereign equality for all states. And the Russians were in the seat when they launched their invasion of a sovereign equal state and tried to overrun Ukraine. So if there is a moment when the arguments for reform of the Security Council ought to resonate, it's right now. But whether the power exists to affect those changes, it doesn't seem likely in my lifetime.
The power or the will, Prof?
Excuse me?
The power or the will?
Yeah, the power of the will, but it is changing. And as I say, if you had Donald Trump and he was aligned with Putin, you'd have a very different U.S. policy toward the G7 and toward the assistance to Ukraine, which has been substantial from the U.S., some $80 billion, which is barely 10% of the U.S. defense budget, but nevertheless, it's substantial. And U.S. leadership of the G7 has been reasserted under Joe Biden for better or for worse. And you just have to accept the fact that democracies are volatile and could change.
Thank you so much, Prof. Professor John Stremlau is an international relations expert.